ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
It's the case that's captured the attention of the world. The mushroom case.
On the menu was beef Wellington.
Erin Patterson is charged with murder. She says she's innocent.
I'm devastated.
Mushroom Case Daily. Hear the podcast on the ABC Listen app.
Podcast and broadcast. This is Conversations with Sarah Kanowski.
Erna Walraven used to begin her working days by saying, "Good morning, boys and girls." But she wasn't talking to kids. Erna was addressing 30 chimpanzees, waiting to be given their breakfast and to be let out into their day enclosure. For 2 decades, Erna was the senior curator at Taronga Zoo. As the sun was coming up, she would walk through those iconic zoo gates and see Sydney Harbour sparkling in the distance over the heads of the giraffes, hearing the sounds of the lions and monkeys and birds as the zoo woke up. All of this was a long way from Erna's childhood in the Netherlands, where as a little girl she was forbidden to wear woolen hats or gloves in the wintertime. She and her sister had to prove themselves by jumping off high walls and swimming across the Rhine, dodging barges and boats. This Spartan upbringing was intended to make them tough. And it turned out Erna needed all those reserves of resilience and hardiness when she started out as one of the first female zookeepers in Australia. Not because of the wild animals though, but in order to deal with her male co-workers. Her book is Hear Me Roar. Hi, Erna.
Hi there, Sarah.
Before we talk about zookeeping, tell me about some of the other jobs you've had in your life, because it's been quite a mix.
Yes, quite a lot. My parents used to send me out as a debt collector. When I was only about 13, I'd go off on my push bike. They had an insurance brokerage, and any families that were behind on their life insurance or funeral insurance, people used to pay monthly, I think it was. They'd send me out with a little book so that I could write the receipt
and did you have to
give
use
it to them.
Standover tactics, or what was your approach?
I think just seeing a 13-year-old on a bike was enough for them to go and scrounge around. It was never very big quantities of money. It was just, a few guilders here and there they had to put towards their funeral over the years. And that was one of the first jobs. But I've been a dog washer, a cleaner, a petrol pump attendant. Gosh, there have been so many. A translator and interpreter. That was actually a serious job. I just happened to be good at languages. So that was one of my first jobs in Australia. I worked for the Commonwealth Bank in their Migrant Information Service.
What brought you to Australia in the first place?
Love, as it is for so many people. I picked up a penniless Aussie backpacker in Spain.
Is there any other kind, Erna?
No, probably not.
But you found yours in Spain and followed him back here.
That's right. I was living in Spain at the time. I moved to Spain when I was 18, and I lived there for about 7 years and then came across Rob. And that was too much love to resist, really. I had to chase him halfway across the world. I had never really thought about a career. I just did languages because I happened to be good at them. It wasn't something I loved, so I realised I loved animals. It was a passion that had never waned. From when I was the littlest person, the animals in my life were so important.
Tell me about your very first interview then at Taronga Zoo. What did you wear?
I had to borrow a dress because I thought that's what you do. You wear a dress to a uniform. And I didn't have any because I've always been a bit of a, boyish kind of person. So Rob's Auntie Jane lent me a frock. And it was early 80s. So it was like a safari suit in beige with pockets and a belt. And
that's very appropriate.
I looked very smart, I thought.
So you had enthusiasm. You'd also picked up some qualifications with zookeeping before this interview. But
Yeah.
what questions or what hurdles did the staff think were ahead of you?
They thought I was there for the glamour, I think. Did I think it was a glamorous job? How did I feel taking a job that a man could do? They took me to the loading dock, and there were 3 huge Hessian bags waiting at the bottom of the loading dock. Now, loading docks are tall because they have to sort of line up with the back of a big truck. And they told me to lift them up. And it was, a bit, I don't know, they were obviously trying to catch me out. It was, come on, girlie, let us see you lift that up there. They were 50 kilos. So there I was in Auntie Jean's frock, lifting Hessian bags, and I got them up there. Not glamorous, I'm sure.
Well, you did eventually get a job. You get your foot in the door at Taronga Zoo. First of all, working as a zookeeper with the vet. What did a typical day involve when you were in that first role at Taronga?
The most exciting thing was there wasn't a typical day. So we looked after the animals in quarantine, coming into the zoo, coming into Australia from other zoos overseas or in Australia, and animals going out because there are breeding programs and you exchange genetic material for good breeding results. Any animals that came in sick, injured, orphaned wildlife, there were special rooms for that to keep them separate from the animal collection. And there were animals in the zoo that were sick that had to be in hospital for a period of time. They might have had an operation for whatever reason, or they broke a leg or whatever it was. So it was never normal.
One of the animals that you had there in the hospital was Roy the orangutan. How did you get him to take his medication? How does one do that with an orangutan?
Well, knowing what they like and then mixing it in there, Roy was particularly fond of yogurt. So we could put some of his medication in there and then slowly feed it to him, hoping you'd get the spoon back when it was in his mouth. Often you needed to exchange the spoon for a bit of banana or something. Bartering was part of the process. And I would sit on the outside of his enclosure and he obviously on the inside, because if he wanted to, he could rip my arms off, which, just to get the medication in is a bit of a hard price to pay. So, and he was gorgeous. He was gorgeous. There's these long locks, these long red locks.
I mean, of course, a lot of these animals, wild animals, are potentially very dangerous for you. I mean, what's it like to travel in the back of a van with a tiger that you know is sedated, but are you really confident that sedation's going to last as long as it needs to?
You really need to trust the vet that he got the right amount of medication in. And all of these drugs are based on the weight of the animal. And at that stage, you got to guess it. So you get very good at guessing what the weight is. And then it's a very dangerous drug. And you have to have the antidote immediately there. Because if the vet or anyone else gets stabbed, you immediately need to do that. But being in the back of the truck, because you get locked in, and the animal's on a stretcher with a net over it, and you're just hoping and praying that it's not going to wake up on you. That's tense.
Did that ever happen to you, or do vets always get those doses right?
Not in the back of a truck, but one day we were doing some health checks on some chimpanzees that were going to live in another zoo. And when one of the vets and I were carrying her to get a good weight on her, she was starting to wake up and starting to, throw her arms and legs around. And we just managed to wrestle her into the hospital den. And then, weak at the knees, broke out laughing hysterically that we'd survived it. Because chimpanzees are enormously strong. They're all muscle.
You had quite a lot to do with the chimpanzees, which are such crowd favourites at Taronga Zoo, and I think really at any zoo. When it was your turn, Erna, to let out the chimps from their night house, how did you know it was safe to go in the morning? What ingenious trick had a zookeeper worked out?
Yeah, one zookeeper, Paul Davies, he showed me the ropes the first time. I used to have to go in and give an insulin injection to a diabetic chimpanzee, Susie. So I was often the first one in there because they had to be done first thing in the morning. And he showed me that there was a little window. So you came into the keeper kitchen first, and then there was a little window next to the door to their enclosure that he put a banana in. So if anyone got out, that banana would be gone. So the first thing you did was check, is the banana there before you opened the door? And then it's a bit of a U shape, and there are runways top and bottom so that animals can get away from each other. If there's any confrontations between individuals, they can run away without getting into too much trouble. So keepers walk around in that U shape so that they can access all areas and open slides, we call them, sort of metal doors that go on pulleys vertically. So you have access to all of that from in there.
When you would greet those chimps with your cheery good morning, boys and girls, how did they respond?
Oh, there was often quite excitement because they know the day has begun. There was some jealousy of Susie, because Susie would be in a separate bedroom because we had to measure her urine. So there was
How do you measure her urine?
Well, there were little gutters in the concrete that we had to make specially for Susie, so that if she weed, the urine went into the gutter, and you then had a little syringe, you soak it up, then you could measure how much insulin she needed for the day. And Susie was very good. She would do anything for a banana. So she would press her back against the wire so that you could inject the insulin into her back. But there was another chimpanzee, Spitter, and for obvious reasons.
How did Spitter feel about you as the zookeeper?
Spitter had one joke, and that was she would run to the automatic water supply, get a mouthful of water, and as soon as she turned your back to measure the urine or to give Susie her injection, she'd let go, and she had extremely good aim. She would have to go across the keeper corridor with a mouthful of water, and she always got you on the back or on your head. She was excellent.
And she was doing this for the fun of it? What do you think?
Yeah,
What's her behaviour about?
You could see if she got a good aim, she would sort of roll back laughing. I mean, she thought it was hilarious. And she never got over that joke. It was, that was Spitter's thing.
It was golden every time that she did it. How many female zookeepers were there at Taronga when you joined?
There was one other nurse in the veterinary hospital. There was one woman in the children's zoo, so like a little orphanage. And that was about it. So there were three of us in the very early days, yeah. And they weren't doing the rounds, out there with the big dangerous animals. But once I started in the zoo hospital, you had to learn all the routines on all the different animal sections. So I would go to, carnivores for a week, and they would have to send someone up from their division to make up the numbers in the vet hospital.
And what did your male colleagues think of you joining this team?
I think it was a big letdown. They were big, tough lion tamers, and then suddenly a girl could do the job. I think it felt like it diminished their status in life. I think there were a few good blokes, but the old cranky ones sort of had the control of the culture very much.
How did they make that clear? What kind of things did you experience in those first months?
Like in a lot of places, new staff get given a bit of a hard time to test them out. But I felt that in my case it was exacerbated a little bit by the fact that I was a woman. I was 31 at the time, so quite, a bit older too for a junior zookeeper. I was employed as the lowest of the low junior keeper. So they played lots of tricks, like, putting on your gumboots, you realise someone's put some animal poo in them. Or they'd find your lunch sandwich in the fridge and they'd take out the cheese and put dead baby mice on it. Or they locked me up with a reticulated python when I did an exchange with the reptile department.
Locked you in the cage?
The animal was off display, so it was in a small windowless room, and it was on newspaper, as you do when an animal is not on display. So it had pooed on the newspaper, and I was told to go and change the newspaper. It was a 7-metre reticulated python. In Asia, it's known to eat small humans. Luckily, I wasn't a small human. All I could think of is hope they fed it recently. So I had to lift up big coils of snake and pull the newspaper out. That's when I first realised that fear can make you sweat quite excessively at the moment. And my male colleagues were sitting outside for morning tea, laughing their heads off. They thought it was hilarious. I heard them lock the door behind me, and I thought, I'm not going to get out without doing this. There's just no way I'm going to let them have the last laugh. So, yeah, I got it done.
What decorated the staff kitchen when you started?
Well, there was one place where there was pornography on the whiteboard that had the diets of the animals on it. And I was chopping food for the animals next to a bloke. In the book, I call him Blondie. And we're making polite conversation, as you do when you're both, preparing food. But in front of me is a woman with her legs open.
So explicit
She had no
porn.
clothes. She had no clothes on. So very uncomfortable. It was very intimidating for a woman to stand there next to a big bloke. So I waited until his day off, and I peeled them off very carefully, rolled them up. I didn't rip any of them, and I put them in his locker. And I'd been collecting posters of baby tigers and baby lions and little kittens, and I put them on the whiteboard with a big banner above it. We both like these pussies.
That's just brilliant, Erna. Well done. How did he react?
He didn't say a word. I don't know whether he took his beloved posters home.
I mean, were you surprised, Erna, about that kind of explicit sexism at work? I mean, did it feel different from what you were used to in the Netherlands?
Yeah. The Netherlands, I'd happily participated in the liberation of my gender. When I moved to Spain, things were different. But in Spain, I was expecting the kind of machoism I found there. But I wasn't expecting Australia to be as sexist as I found it to be.
There were lots of challenges from the animals, not just the human animals at Taronga Zoo. Tell me, for example, how you move a rhino.
Well, in those days, it's a little safer now, but in those days I was working with a big Welshman with quite a tummy, and he was showing me the ropes on how to get Dinah and Taronga, were their names, on display. And they were in enclosures that had a long corridor alongside it that then took them out to the paddock where they had to go. And the way to get them, they've got poor eyesight, so we would call them. He showed me how to do that. You just make a lot of noise, but then you wiggle your body and you move your arms and your legs so that they see this moving target. And slowly they start gaining momentum. And once they got a lot of momentum, you had to run ahead of them through that corridor. But fortunately, I fitted between the bars quite early and I could get out. But the poor man who was showing me had to go all the way to the end to then duck around at the end because he didn't fit between the bars anymore. And when we got there, he said, I think I have to go on a diet.
Was there any risk that the rhino would catch up?
Yes.
What would it do if it caught up to you?
If you fall, obviously, I am quite clumsy, but luckily I never did fall over. You just have to be steady on your feet and climb. We had to climb up a bit to get between the bars. You have to be fast. But it was, we enjoyed being wild cowboy types, I think. I think we all thought it was rather good fun.
What technique did you use to stop wombats from biting your ankles, which was not something I knew wombats did?
Oh, yeah, they're ankle biters. Oh, yeah, this was a hairy-nosed wombat in the nocturnal house. Hagar was his name. Not quite appropriate for a wombat, perhaps, but his name was Hagar. And Hagar loved going for the ankles. So the way to clean in Hagar's enclosure was you'd let him out in the corridor so that, he would be away, but then he'd come chasing you. And the only way to stop getting bitten is to hop in the garbage bin that you brought with you, those big plastic bins, and you had a shovel and a rake for your cleaning. And then you'd hop inside the bin to wherever you had to go, move the bin with you to get out and away from him. But, the downside was that whatever you scooped up, mostly shit, obviously. You would have to throw that on front of your feet and hoping it didn't go into your gumboots.
Or adding to that delicious potpourri of aromas that you were marinating in all day. I guess you're always being very careful of trying to not let any animal escape. Were there some when you were at Taronga that were better at escaping than others?
Yeah. Some of them were absolute escape artists. Echidnas, no one would think so. Echidnas are fabulous escape artists. They can climb wire really high up. Yeah, they're fabulous. They can swim with their snorkel above the water. They're great. But there was one, red panda, and her name was Mayhem. For obvious reasons. Get out all the time, and we'd have to go looking. And
where would she go?
Well, we found her in the gardens of Mossman. Taronga Zoo is surrounded by salubrious houses, and some of them grow lovely bamboo fence lines.
Perfect for a panda.
Perfect for a panda. So we'd go looking for her wherever there was bamboo. We'd go and have a good look. But usually, the people in the house would see something that wasn't quite normal in their bamboo and ring us and say, "Well, I think we've got one of your residents here."
And how would you get her back if she'd escaped?
Well, one of her keepers had a very good rapport and would just call her and she'd come back.
Wow.
Yeah. And that was the case with many animals, that, they would respond well to the people they trust because, you train them over the years to give them little treats. And if you're there with a couple of grapes and Mayhem is keen, she'll come down.
Wombats and pandas are one kind of thing, but of course there are real dangers that zookeepers face in the work that you do. And a terrible thing happened while you were at the zoo in 1998 when a colleague lost their life. Tell me about that day.
Yeah. Well, that's a day, of course, that's engraved in all of our brains and hearts. We lost a colleague called Vicky Scrivener, and she, at lunchtime, went in to photograph the cubs. The adult tigers had some lovely cubs, and often it's difficult to operate the machinery. A lot of the zoo in those days were still facilities that were built in 1916 when the zoo opened. And in order to move those vertical slides, you had your back to what you were doing, and you sort of had to crane your neck to see whether you were doing it right. She thought she had locked both the male and the female out, but the male must have snuck back under when the slide was nearly all the way down. So she was photographing the cubs. There were 2 women there at the time, and the tiger got her and dragged her out into the yard. And members of the public alerted keepers who were immediately there with hoses and guns and trying to separate. They managed to separate the male. One of the keeper who was with her, went in and took her boot off. That was all she had, and mashed the tiger on its head to try and get him to let go of her friend. The vet who was right there immediately provided first aid until the ambulance came. And, obviously the injuries were too bad and she died overnight. So that was a big wake-up call for all of us. There were more women by then, and suddenly it was important that we worked together, that, we were safe, that we wouldn't take the risks that we were taking. And things changed a lot in the culture of safety, but also in the culture of seeing each other as valued workmates.
On the other end of the spectrum from tigers are baby animals, and you would often take work home, quite literally. Tell me about the babies that would be in your care.
Yeah, I had babies all the time. So mostly the animals that are brought in by members of the public so sick, injured, orphaned. So mostly the orphans need care overnight. We're only there from early morning to late afternoon, but those animals need care overnight. So you take them home and you bottle feed, and it's anything from kangaroos to wombats to koalas to flying foxes to birds.
Would those animals recognise you again, Erna, if they were then ended up in the zoo afterwards?
A lot of them would. One of my fondest memories is Klinger, a grey-headed flying fox. He was named because he was found clinging to his dead mother who had been electrocuted, and he was still alive. And he unfortunately developed some bone lesions that would grow little lumps, and he had surgery and he couldn't be released. So I was able to spend more time with him, and he was going to live in the zoo education centre where he could educate kids about bats not being bad things. They don't get stuck in your hair. They are pollinators. They are fabulous. And I was able to teach Klinger all sorts of tricks, like, you know, kids in the classroom loved it when you show how a bat has a pee, because they hang upside down. You don't want to pee on yourself, so you turn your bottom down. So they hang by their thumbs, so their bum faces downwards so that they don't wet themselves. Although on a hot day, when you go through a bat colony, you see that they actually pee on themselves and smear it all over their wings, which they then flap because there's a lot of blood supply there, and it cools them down on really hot days. Amazing. But generally, they pee downwards by hanging on by their thumbs. So that was one of the things I trained him to do, so the kids would have a good giggle. And
when you'd go and see him, would Klinger recognise you, do you think?
Yes, Klinger lived for over 20 years, and every now and then I'd go and see him, and sometimes busy live work, I hadn't been there for months, and as soon as he heard my voice, he would fly over, wrap his wings around my head, and just lick my face. It was just such a delight.
So, Erna, is there a lot of sex at the zoo?
There is. I mean, obviously, amongst the animals, it's what we do. So it can be quite concerning, especially in the early days when lions, they're at it all day. When the female's in season, they mate like all the time and are very vocal, very, very vocal. So, you know, you're having there your cup of tea with your workmates in the morning, and you can just hear the lion having a particularly good time.
And what vocal in what way? Roaring?
Roaring. Yeah, roaring. Yeah. Yeah, very loud, and you can hear it all through the zoo when it's breeding season. Yeah, and obviously we talk about sex a lot, and in those early days when it was quite a sexist place, in order to understand animal husbandry and breeding animals, you need to understand a lot of sex. But as a woman, you had to pretend some innocence to save your reputation. Otherwise, you would be considered like a bit of a hussy or something. So it was a fine balance.
Well, you were interested in learning about how much variety there is of sexuality, of female sexuality in the animal kingdom, including among emus. How does an emu hen show that it's interested in mating?
Yeah. So what struck me when I first started to work with animals is that the whole biology that is written down in those days in particular was incredibly sexist. Females were demure, they were coy. Darwin made it very clear that female animals were not interested in sex. They had to be conquered, and, they reluctantly submitted and all of that. It was also very common to understand that female animals were always subordinate to males. And that was the natural order of things. Therefore, I should pipe down because, men are in charge of this world, because that's the natural order of things in nature. So I became particularly interested in, one, how do female animals in male-dominated societies gain authority and agency? And the other one, where do female animals buck the trend? And emus were one of the first that I realized, because, you have to do a lot of reading on how this works. Female emus seduced the males. And she courts him and all of that.
What sort of way? What's the behaviour?
Strutting, fluffing up your neck feathers, making booming sounds in your throat. And then if he's interested, so they sort of rub their neck and their chest together. And, romance is not dead when you're an emu. But as soon as she's laid the eggs, she's off. So she chooses a male and she's off as soon as she's laid the eggs. And she's looking for more males, for more sex, for more laying eggs.
And so that bucked that whole Darwinian idea that females are subordinate and need to be dominated in order to copulate, that they're trying to avoid sex.
And there are numerous female animals that take control. And Darwin did write at some stage a follow-up on his theory of evolution, and that was called the sexual selection. His theory of sexual selection. So he did realize that females actually selected the males, that males competed for the attention, but females were the ones that selected the male. And he first had that thought by looking at peacocks, because his first theory was all about survival of the fittest. Then when you look at a peacock, he's got this ridiculous long train of a tail. Doesn't help survival, makes you more vulnerable to predators. You can't get away as fast. You can't fly off somewhere as fast. And that was entirely to seduce females. And then he realized there were a lot of animals, like the big antlers on males. The males use that to fight each other, but they drop off often after the breeding season. So, if it was for defense only, why are those things there in the first place? So he called them secondary sexual attributes. And there are lots of males who have that.
What sort of things did you observe, Erna, with those animals that are as closely related to us as chimps and
bonobos?
And monkeys. Yeah, well, tell me about those and how they don't quite accord with those earlier 19th century ideas of science.
We share nearly 99% of our DNA with chimpanzees and bonobos. A lot of people aren't aware of bonobos. There aren't any in Australian zoos.
What do they look like? How do they compare to a chimp?
They look very much like a chimpanzee. They're a bit more slender. Their faces are pinker, and they've got hair that sort of separates in the middle a bit. It's a bit longer, and they're more graceful. Chimpanzees are very stocky. Bonobos are more graceful.
And where do they come from?
They're both live on opposite sides of the Congo River. So the bonobos are on the south side and chimpanzees on the north side. And they probably separated from each other as a species about 1.5 million years ago. Now, that was long enough for bonobos to go, well, things can be different. And they are a matriarchal society, and they are absolutely fascinating. Chimpanzees are often held up to say, well, see, our species, we're so closely related to chimpanzees. They're aggressive. Their males are dominant. They fight all the time. So it's only normal that humans are like that, warlike. Bonobos, they greet friend and foe by having sex. They have more sex than any other animal on the planet. They have sex for recreation because they've just found a lovely fruiting tree and everyone's very excited and they'll have sex.
Male and female? Or?
Male and female and female and female and male and male. Anything goes. The only taboos is mother and sons and babies. So they are very sexually aware and use sex for pleasure, but also to resolve conflict, to get rid of extra excitement, energy, and they are matriarchal. And it's the older females that are in charge. And they run a very egalitarian kind of community. There is very little tolerance for violence from males. And if there is, the females are actually not as big as the males. The males are some 10, 15% larger. But the females don't tackle him on her own. There's a posse of females that puts him right when he oversteps the mark of social behaviour. So that's how they control. But they also, they distribute food equally, whereas in chimpanzees, boy, if you're a big male, you get to the food, it's yours. You know, you might barter it with a female that's in season that you want some favours from, but mostly it's quite a selfish behaviour when food's around. Whereas bonobos are so nice compared with chimpanzees. So I do think we have a lot more in common. So when we decide that, yes, evolutionary influences do exist, lots of people are still reluctant to admit we're just another ape, a naked ape, as Desmond Morris used to call us. And we probably have the yin and yang of bonobos and chimpanzees, and we can bring the kinder attributes to the fore when we want to look at who we are most like.
You became the person in charge of the gorilla breeding program in Australasia. How do you go about matching gorillas? What's in your mind when you're looking for a mate, and how do you find them? Is there like a Tinder for gorillas?
Well, it's almost a bit like that. So every zoo has a regional zoo association. So Australasia is us, Australia, New Zealand, etc. And all animals around the world, in good zoos at least, are in a stud book. So those stud books trace back the very first animals many generations ago that were collected from the wild. We don't do that anymore, but so you know what your genetic diversity is. Now you can import that in special programs that have been developed for looking at the genetic contribution by mating animal A with animal B. So you can look all around the world by taking the international stud book and looking at which animal is going to be most suitable. So we had the most gorgeous gorilla male, Kibabu, but he had sired plenty of offspring and he was getting older. In the wild, he would have been replaced by a younger, more virile male. So we decided that rather than waiting until, the job was too much of him to control his troop, because he was very vigilant. He would freak out when there was a helicopter over and, make sure everyone was all right. And so we started looking around the world, and I matched different animals against the females in Taronga Zoo and also females in any other zoo in Australasia in case, they were related. We wanted the least related animal to us. And you get immediately, you can see whether a particular male will benefit the entire regional program if his offspring come into the population. So we had a short list of about 5-6 animals around the world. And Lou, one of my colleagues, she was the head of the primates at the time at Taronga Zoo, went travelling the world to meet them all.
Prospective males.
Yes, because you want to eyeball them.
What are you looking for when you...
Well, you want to look at behaviour. You don't want some violent animal. You don't want a shit thrower at the public.
You already had Spitter.
Yeah, that's right, we had Spitter. You want an animal that has all the right social behaviours to fit into a very well socially bonded group. So we wanted also, and this is interesting from a human perspective too, we wanted to look at his father. We wanted an animal that was still in the social group with his father so that we could see what kind of a role model he had that perhaps he had modelled his own behaviour on, and perhaps there were the kind of traits that he would take to our girls and treat them nicely.
I feel there are so many human mothers who wish that they could perform some similar methodology and task of finding a suitable mate for their own daughter.
Absolutely.
If only we had your control.
Yes. But it was quite hilarious. I think Lou and I were away for about 2 weeks going to the different zoos, meeting the different animals. Of course, we wrote to the species coordinator in the different regions and said these are the animals we're interested in. Could they possibly be made available to come to Australia? Then once we had the okays, we made contact with those zoos and organised appointments with them so that we can come and have a look. But, Lou and I would stay in hotels and go out eating and people would say, "Oh, what are you girls doing? Are you on a holiday?" Well, actually, we're looking for a new breeding male gorilla. No one ever believed us.
And did you have success?
We did. And it was interesting because we both felt exactly the same about the same animal. We got to a zoo in the south of France, La Vallée des Singes, the Valley of Monkeys. And there was a young male there, Kibali, very confusing. The old one was Kibali, named after a national park in its habitat. And he just had the right behavior. We saw him be gentle with little gorillas in his family. We saw him treat the females nicely. He was trying to get away from his father. He was at the age where his father could start to see him as a threat. And he knew that when his father was looking at him, he would just go around the corner. And then he came from a family of about the same size of the family that he moved into with youngsters. So he was our pick, and the zoo agreed to send him to us, which is a big undertaking. We don't buy animals anymore. They give you the animals under the understanding that it will receive good welfare and good care, and you have the expertise to look after that species, and you have the facilities. And then the only thing the receiving zoo pays for is the transport of the animals and all the paperwork that has to be done. There's lots of permitting, and sending a keeper familiar with the animal to Australia to help it settle in, so it's got a familiar face.
This might be a weird question, Anna, but do you think animals know that sex leads to babies, to offspring?
There's no evidence that they do, and we base that on the fact that humans didn't know, really, until fairly recently in our history. There was in Turkey, in Catalhoyuk, in some caves, there are some drawings of a couple embracing, and on the opposite wall of a female with a baby, which is some hint. I think that those drawings are like 6,000 years old or something. But the time between sex and conception is so long that it is very hard to draw a direct correlation. People knew it had something to do with it, but how it was done wasn't known until we got the microscope, and they could actually see what happens with an egg and a sperm. So that was a very long time after people started to procreate. So the drive, in my opinion, the drive is sexual gratification. That is the absolute drive. The fact that there is offspring, I do not think any animals know. The sex drive is there, and it's a very strong motivation. But the fact that offspring results is not known. I've seen animals so surprised giving birth. You know, female tiger gives birth to cubs for the first time, and she looks like, holy moly, what do I do with that? So that's the other thing that we've been told by biologists from Victorian era, and that has been propagated for, it has served a male-dominated society very well to say all females are good mothers. All females.
It's instinctual.
It's instinct. All females are good mothers. When you work with animals, you realize that is not the case. They are hopeless at the first lot. I mean, so often the first offspring dies. And they learn from that. And, it's interesting because now most humans only have one or two.
Tell me about the early animals in your life. Did you have pets, or was there wildlife around you? What kind of animals did you grow up with?
My parents loved animals. I was allowed to keep any animal as long as it wasn't in a cage. Haha, zookeeper. Or school excursions. I wasn't allowed to go once to the zoo because my parents
Really?
were. Yeah, well, and I think zoos then weren't the zoos of now. I mean, there were very much animals in small cages. So yes, we always had lots of dogs, cats, lambs, turkeys, chickens, loads. And I can remember I had a raven once that had a broken, which is quite funny because my name is Walraven, a tame raven. My earliest memories are of a black German shepherd called Peter. That was, my mate.
Your parents were young adults during the war when the Netherlands was invaded and occupied by the Germans. What did your mum experience during the Second World War?
Mum was amazing. I mean, in hindsight, you don't know that when you grow up. But she was also good at languages, and she got a job with the Ortskommandant as a secretary. So the Germans occupied the town and then just put a layer of authority on top. And the Ortskommandant was the highest German in town. Her father worked for the underground, as did she, and she would, everything she typed for him, she took a carbon copy and smuggled it out in the afternoon when she left in her handbag, and then gave it to her father, who passed it on down the line.
It's so risky.
It was very risky, very risky. That wasn't the riskiest thing she did. She was also involved in taking Allied soldiers along the line, so they'd fall with parachutes. They'd hopefully get to a safe house, passed on to the people working in the underground. And then it was usually young women who took them at night from village to village. Now, there was curfew at night. No one was allowed to be out. If you know anything about Holland, you know there's a lot of water, and they built high roads called dikes to keep the water at one side. And you'd have to walk along those dikes to the next village. There's no lights. And if anyone came, they'd have to roll off the dike into the grass, pretending to be a young couple canoodling and hoping that they walked past. Incredibly risky. And she tells a story. I think it was a Canadian soldier. And they were walking along, and they could hear a German group of soldiers coming with their boots and singing their songs. So they rolled off into the grass, and he got a bit frisky, apparently. He took advantage, I think, because she couldn't call out. She couldn't do anything. And I said, Mum, what did you do? She said, I kneed him in the balls. He had as much to lose as I did. He couldn't scream either.
What about your dad? What was his experience during the war?
Yeah, I think my dad was more traumatized. I realise now that he probably had PTSD. We didn't know about that then. He was also in the underground. He was taken off the street during what was called a razzia, where the Germans would come into town and take all men of a certain age. And he was sent to a concentration camp. Because he was an incredibly tall, good-looking, blonde, blue-eyed man, he got special treatment. He got to work in the kitchen, which was quite fortunate, I suppose. But he did escape from there and went underground in the north of Holland.
How do you think that shaped the way he fathered you, parented
I think
you and your
that's why
sister?
we had to be so tough. All this being tough was about, if you end up in a concentration camp, you'll be more likely to survive. Yeah, we were only allowed 2 blankets in the middle of winter, had to sleep with the windows open. Luckily, we had a lot of dogs.
Kept you warm.
A German shepherd on the bed keeps you warm.
How do you feel about that part of your childhood now? I mean, is there any sense in which you're grateful for that hardiness?
I hate cold. Hate cold. Don't like
so you
it.
moved to Australia, I guess.
Moved to Spain first. It was nice and warm. Well, I guess being tough, there's nothing wrong with, developing a bit of toughness. But, I don't think it was always enjoyable, obviously. I'm reasonably tough, so it probably helped a bit in that regard.
You might have been tough anyway, coming from your mum.
Yeah,
you
right.
mightn't have needed to not have enough blankets.
Yeah, Mum was very courageous, I think.
You've left Taronga Zoo now, and you talk, though, about, in the book, you write about the way that this stage of your life, there's still things that you can learn from animals, the animals that you've known, the animals that are around you in your life now. What kind of wisdom do you have from other species around how to flourish at this stage of life?
The main thing I learned from animals is that When females stick together and stand up for each other, their lives are better. When females stand up for their rights, their lives are better. Older animals are interesting too, because some of the matriarchal societies in the animal world, it's the older females that are the repository of wisdom, of care for the group. Female elephants, they're always matriarchs that really embody the nurturing, the wisdom, the trust that is bestowed upon her is not gained through fighting. Male animal dominance, like the alpha chimpanzee, has to fight to be the leader. So older animals, reaching an age, with every stage of, or topics in our lives, I've looked at animals for how does it work? How does that reflect upon us humans? And once again, when you become older and menopause starts to hit, you think, well, who else does this? What other animals go through this? And it turns out it's only about 5 whale species. And the wisdom of these species, of these long-lived species, is what makes those communities thrive. So we have opportunities. As older women, we shouldn't just be considered as the ones who might do the babysitting. We have a lot more to do.
Anna, it has been absolutely fascinating to hear some of your stories from your life with animals. Thank you so much for being my guest on Conversations.
It's my absolute pleasure, Sarah. Thank you.
Podcast, broadcast, Conversations with Sarah Kanowski.
Erna Walraven was my guest on Conversations. Erna is a former senior curator at Taronga Zoo, and her book, Hear Me Roar, is published by Affirm Press. This episode was produced on Yagara and Turrbal lands. It was produced by Alice Moldovan. Our executive producer is Nicola Harrison. I'm Sarah Kanowski. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.